Try it again.
Okay, the microphone is working now. Welcome, everyone, to the second last session of what's been a very full day. My name is Peggy Mason from the Rideau Institute, a small think tank in Ottawa. We like to think we punch above our weight, but we have the distinction of being, we use the word independent, truly independent, because we don't accept money from either government or industry, which is why we're so small. But anyway, I have great pleasure to be here. I have the privilege to be on the board of advisors of the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy and have participated in all of their Middle East strategy forums. And the title of this panel, as you all will have seen, is the future of the nuclear proliferation regime in the Middle East, Iran, and beyond. Now, for those of us working in this field, normally the reference would be to the nuclear non-proliferation regime in the region. I hope this is just a Freudian slip and not a prophecy. But there you have it. Getting the juices flowing a little bit near the end of the day. So, as I said, second last panel, and of course there's been a lot of discussion around the broader political and geopolitical implications of what's going on in the region, and we are going to, and nicely introduced to our panelists by the last keynote, because we're going to zero in and look very specifically at the risk of nuclear proliferation in the region, what's happening there. And for our panel, and I'm not going to do any more, the bios you all have, and in the interest of time, I'm just going to run through quickly the titles and affiliations of our esteemed panel. We've got two, where are our other panel? Oh, there they are, right in front of me. Blinded by the light as I am, I can barely see them, but here with me, Kane, Middle East Nonproliferation Program Director at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies at the Middlebury Institute for International Studies, and the founder of the Middle East Next Generation Arms Control Network. And to my right, to my left, Farzan Sabet. I didn't ask you actually how to pronounce your last name. Researcher for the Global Governance Center at the Graduate Institute of Geneva. And coming to us virtually, Kelsey Davenport, Director for Nonproliferation Policy for the Washington-based Arms Control Association. I always refer to it in my blogs as the prestigious Arms Control Association. I think it deserves that. And Henry Rome, a Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. So we've got 1 hour, and as others have said, these are topics that any part of which we could spend much more than an hour. So we'll just barrel on here. And we're going to not really have opening statements, but go right into questions. But of course, panelists will be invited to, to address them as they see fit. So the opening sort of umbrella question is, which of course has come up throughout the day, is Saudi Arabia, nuclear power, and the grand bargain. Saudi Foreign Minister Faisal bin Farhan al Saud has expressed his country's interest, as we've heard today, developing a civilian nuclear program, and is reportedly considering a Chinese bid to build a nuclear power plant. At the same time, the Biden administration is pursuing a so-called grand bargain in the Middle East that includes normalization of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which of course has been discussed. A key concession being sought by Saudi Arabia in this negotiation, as was referenced by a previous keynote speaker, is access to uranium enrichment technology, ostensibly to provide fuel for future Saudi nuclear power plants. Of course, the Iranian rationale as well. So here's the question for Dr. Kane first. What are the nuclear proliferation implications of such a deal? what role will the IAEA play in verifying Saudi Arabia's nuclear enrichment activities? And what about the broader security implications given the instability in the Middle East, including a long list of nuclear reactors in the region being targeted in aerial attacks? And I'm going to ask Dr. Kane first, and then Dr. Farzan, and then I'm going to add a slightly different take on it for Kelsey Davenport. Please.
Thank you, and thank you for the organizing. I will start with really setting up about the scene of the Saudi nuclear program, given the fact that we have been talking about it bits and pieces, but not really understanding where it is right now and what the status. So originally, it really started as part of a GCC, a sub-regional program. When the UAE started its national program, also the Saudis started theirs. And in 2011, they started really with the idea of building 12 reactors. They scaled back really fast when the plans become a little bit more realistic. And currently, they're considering construction of two 1,400 megawatt of PWRs, which is power water reactors. Aside of those two large NPPs, the nuclear power plants, they're also working with South Korea on development of a small, medium category of nuclear power reactor, what we call the SMART design, and with China on HTDR, the high-temperature gas-cooled reactor for water desalination. In addition, also, they explore building the front end of their nuclear capabilities, and they explore so far, mainly with China, the domestic uranium and thorium deposit in the country, and indicated also some interest also to convert uranium to yellow cake. Last, also, Argentina constructed a nuclear research reactor, very small, 30 kilowatt of light water research reactor outside of Riyadh, which has been near completion for many years. One of the reasons is that really the Saudis have not signed until their announcement yesterday they signed on comprehensive safeguard agreement, but it was really put on freeze. Well, they had the old SQP, small quantities protocol. That means that really the IAEA did not conduct its verification activities. They announced yesterday that actually they are rescinding the SQP and they're implementing the comprehensive safeguard agreement, which will allow Argentina to transfer fuel to the reactor. So, but going back to the nuclear power program, so far the Saudis did not make a decision who will be the suppliers. And until now, really, I spoke about the Saudi nuclear program that, as you can see, it's really in its infancy, as was discussed in the previous panel. But why we are so obsessed with the Saudis, why we are really concerned about it. So when really examining some of their statements as well as some of the action, and I will speak about those in a second, several aspects raise concern about their nuclear intentions. The first, I will say, is Saudi statements, including by Mohammed bin Salman, that really stated that Riyadh will seek to develop nuclear weapons capability if Iran will pursue it as well. And as we know, Iran has right now between 3 to 5 significant quantity of fissile materials that will be sufficient for 3 to 5 bombs if they decide to weaponize them. The second second area that raised concern is what Saudi has been refusing to adopt several agreements or treaties, for example, the comprehensive test ban treaties, but also the adoption of the additional protocol. And the additional protocol is a protocol that gives the IAEA additional rights and capabilities to go and verify that there are no undeclared activities in a state. And the Saudis has been refusing to adopt it for many years now. And last, the Saudis' ballistic arsenals. We do know that they got from China two types, so one for 2,000 kilometers and another for 3,000 kilometers, that usually those range are mainly for nuclear weapons capabilities. And reportedly, they also pursued a ballistic missile production capability that will be necessary if they ever decide to deliver a nuclear payload. So many of those the statements as well as those activities and those policies really created the suspicions that they might be trying to adopt a hedging strategy to develop commercial and research nuclear program to maintain really the potential pathway, if they decide to do that, towards pursuing nuclear weapons to counter mainly Iran. And that brings us really to the suppliers of who might supply to a nuclear reactor to to Saudi Arabia. The Saudis issues RFP in 2017. So far, 5 different countries answered to the RFP: the U.S., Russia, France, China, and South Korea. And as we said before, the Saudis have not made a decision who will be the supplier. Obviously, because of the Saudi position in the region, their importance in the region, the cost of such a project, which is in the tens of billions, as well as the non-proliferation concerns about the Saudi intentions, the Saudi deal and decision who will be the suppliers is going to be strategic. It's not a commercial or financial one. And so examining what are the Saudis' options for supply, I will discuss here the US, and then in the Q&A, I will be happy to speak about the other ones. The US and the Saudis have been trying to negotiate a 123 agreement, which is the nuclear cooperation agreement, which is required by the US legislation, by Congress, in order to transfer any reactor to a third country for many, many years, for over a decade. And I would say also such an agreement will be required if the Saudi will choose South Korea as a supplier, because the South Korean technology are based on US Westinghouse technology. So when they, even if they choose South Korea, for example, they will need to have such an agreement. So since, but the US has 2 conditions that practically the Saudis have been refusing so far, and that's the reason why we don't have an agreement. Since mid-1990s, although it's not required in the US legislation, the US practice has been to require additional protocol for all their new 123 agreements. Any new 123 agreements that has been signed by the US since 1996, when the additional protocol was concluded, include also additional protocol. The Saudis have been refusing to adopt that, and that's one of the reasons why there is no such an agreement. The second demands that the US added since the nuclear cooperation agreement that they signed with the Emirati are restriction on, or really the country foregoing their right for enrichment and reprocessing. Under the NPT, every country has the right to pursue enrichment and reprocessing as long as it's under safeguard agreement, but the US actually included that in the 123 agreement with the UAE, which considered the gold standards, and they've been trying to implement it unsuccessfully most of the time with other agreements. And so far, the Saudis have refused to adopt those restrictions on their program, given the fact that the JCPOA practically allowed Iran to have enrichment, so they say, why we will take on those restrictions. So those really have been the stumbling blocks of 123 agreements with the US. And then now we have this new idea of a grand deal, and I will bargain that I will not cover the other aspects of it, which is obviously the Israeli-Palestinian, and there are several others. But really the interesting part about what the Saudi demands in the new normalization agreement with Israel is their request to demand to exploit their extensive uranium reserve for restricted nuclear program, civil nuclear program. What is important to remember, and that will be, that there are 2 more demands that usually are not, they're not necessarily non-proliferation aspects, but they're important for our discussion. And the one is written commitment of Congress, affirming that the US-Saudi alliance, and also commitment to follow through the weapon supply of Saudi, as it was a NATO-like country, and most of them were suspended after the Khashoggi assassination. So really the reason for the Saudis to ask for those demands under normalization agreement is really not the US, it's Israel. What they believe is that Israel can deliver, so first those demands, as anyone that knows the US bureaucracy, is that those demands are not from the US administration. Those demands are going to Congress. Congress is the one that decides on those issues. So the Saudi believes that Congress will be more inclined to say yes if it's part of normalization agreement that Israel supports, and they also believe that Israel can deliver Congress much more than the administration. So this is really the rationale behind this grand bargaining and why they're asking those as part of normalization agreement. The last I will conclude with that is what is the Israeli position of that, right? So Israel's traditional position was opposing any enrichment and reprocessing for countries in the region, and have been lobbying for many, many years that this Saudi agreement with nuclear cooperation agreement with the US will not include enrichment and reprocessing, but actually the gold standards where the Saudis will relinquish these rights. But as the relationship with Saudi improved for Israel, one end. On the other end, Russia and China become a potential supplier, is much more attractive because the Saudis have been playing them against each other. Israel really facing a dilemma. First, insisting on agreement that include a gold standard may not be achievable, and also may alienate Saudi Arabia and jeopardize the rapprochement between the two countries, and might push Riyadh at the end to get Russian or Chinese reactors. But the current government in Israel, because it's unique in many ways, or more precisely, the current prime minister, he has an even more complex dilemma. Netanyahu really believes that agreement will allow him to gain the public support that he needs to stay out of jail. And we can speak about how he thinks about doing it. But if he makes the concession on the Palestinian issues, and that's something that will have to be as part of the agreement because of the Saudi demand. So therefore, in really dramatic change from the traditional Israeli position, and in contrast also to the recommendation of his bureaucracy, is really the current prime minister seems that he's not opposing an agreement with Israel-Saudi cooperation agreement that allow enrichment under very strict safeguards. So I will conclude with that, and then we can continue during the Q&A.
Thank you. Well, thank you for throwing us right into the tremendous complexities. Now, I'm going to turn in a minute to Kelsey Davenport on the broader shifts in the non-proliferation regime that might be impacting. But just before I get to that, I thought I'd turn to you, Dr. Farzan, just in light of the research that you've done in the past on the Middle East zone free of weapons of mass destruction, which, I mean, that's in the broader context of, as recently as the last nuclear non-proliferation treaty, Arab states reinforcing the importance of that. And there's, for those that know the history of this, there's a huge amount of effort that goes into managing that issue and the commitment to have conferences with respect to it and so on. So with that as the sort of background, so my question is, during the 10th review conference of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty last year, Arab states reiterated their call for establishing a Middle East zone free of weapons of mass destruction. Now, given the discussion that we've launched into now, what role do you think this long-standing goal can play, one have to put in brackets, if any, at least at this point, in contributing to reducing the risk or strengthening the nuclear non-proliferation regime in the region?
So for those who may not be aware, the Middle East WMD free zone concept originated in 1974 at the time of the UN General Assembly at the time, so 49 years ago, as the Middle East nuclear weapons free zone. And the idea was, and it was a resolution co-sponsored by Iran and Egypt, and the idea was to create, like other zones that, like the Latin American zone that had come into existence at the time, an area in the Middle East that would be free of nuclear weapons. Subsequently, following the first Persian Gulf War, the concept was expanded to cover weapons of mass destruction more broadly, partly to entice Israel to join this process. Now, over the last 49, nearly 50 years that this concept has existed, the concept is actually a little bit older than 49 years, but during this period where it's been formally articulated by states of the region, it's gone through many iterations. The most recent iteration is a consequence of an initiative by the states of the region themselves, including the League of Arab States, as well as the Islamic Republic of Iran. And in terms of how it can help, I guess, advance non-proliferation in the region, I think it forms quite a good forum and dedicated forum, which is connected both to the General Assembly as well as to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, for the states of the region to come together in order to discuss these issues and look at what arrangements are mutually acceptable amongst themselves. Now, of course, there's one key player who is currently missing from participation with this in this in these negotiations, in these discussions, which are held or supposed to be held November of each year, although the conference was missed for its second session during the COVID-19 pandemic. Israel, of course, Israel is not present, and creating any zone requires Israel to enter into negotiations and agree to its various provisions for it to potentially go into force, depending on how it's formulated, and for it to make a meaningful contribution to kind of conclusively addressing issues of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction in the region. I don't foresee the zone necessarily leading the resolution of existing proliferation issues in the region, whether it's regarding the capabilities believed to be possessed by Israel, whether it's the Iran nuclear issue, or whether it's any questions surrounding the Saudi program. I think those issues will likely be addressed in other fora and in linkage with other issues. At the same time, I think, like I said at the beginning of my remarks, that the zone still can be a meaningful forum for countries to come together, see what treaty or what provisions of a treaty are mutually acceptable, and so perhaps coming towards an end of a process where the Iranian issue has been addressed, the Saudi issue has, whether it comes to exist or not, has been addressed, and the Israel's security concerns have been addressed. I think the zone would potentially be a great capstone to consolidate regional norms as well as a regional treaty to put to rest the issue of WMD in the region. So in that context, I think it's potentially very useful in the long term, and of course it has its short-term uses as well. But until such a time as Israel enters the process and maybe some of these broader questions which are being dealt with and historically are viewed outside of a UN and outside of a zone framework are dealt with, I think its contributions will not be as substantive as they could be in the future.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. And I'm now going to turn to Dr. Kelsey Davenport with the question, how are the broader shifts in the non-proliferation regime impacting the proliferation risk in Saudi Arabia and in the region? Please, Kelsey.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you to the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy for the invitation. I'm really sorry I can't be with all of you in person, but I appreciate the opportunity to join virtually. So coming back to your question, I think we cannot look at Saudi Arabia, at Iran, and their nuclear decision-making in a vacuum. These developments are really playing out against a broader weakening of nonproliferation norms kind of across the larger nonproliferation and disarmament architecture. And I think the erosion of these norms will contribute to countries as they make their decisions about whether or not to pursue a hedging capability or even eventually make the decision to pursue nuclear weapons. So there are 2 points I would draw out in particular when talking about the shifts we're seeing more broadly on nonproliferation. First is that P5 unity, and by the P5 I mean the 5 recognized nuclear weapon states: the United States, the UK, France, Russia, and China. The unity that the P5 has traditionally shared about prioritizing nonproliferation, it really has eroded over the past several years. And I really date this shift to about 2018. And up until then, generally saw these 5 countries willing to cooperate to prevent states from proliferating, to prevent states from further building out illicit nuclear arsenals. North Korea, Iran, strong responses at the Security Council as these states violated their international nuclear obligations. But that really has changed. And I think it suggests that the era of P5 prioritization on nonproliferation is over. Over the past several years, Russia and China have shielded North Korea from any consequences for developing its nuclear capable ballistic missiles. They've shielded Iran from having to meet their obligations at the International Atomic Energy Agency. And then, of course, we also have Russia's just overall very blatant undermining of broader non-proliferation norms. So it becomes easier for would-be proliferators to exploit these differences when we don't have strong P5 plus unity. And it also weakens the traditional tools that states have used to counter proliferators. These tools become less powerful if we don't see more cohesion at the international level in terms of enforcement. One tool in particular that has been frequently used to put pressure on proliferators is, of course, sanctions, and not just unilateral sanctions, but sanctions and diplomatic isolation at the UN Security Council. And I think it's becoming more clear that that may not be a viable route moving forward to pressure states that might be looking to develop nuclear weapons capabilities. So sanctions, do not exert as much pressure, in this situation, and that's playing against a space too where the P5s have lost credibility as viable negotiating. And here I'm speaking, of course, of the case of Iran, where even when the United States, withdrew from the 2015 nuclear deal, the Europeans were unable to deliver on the sanctions relief envisioned by that accord, absent the United States. So the ability of these states to exert pressure and provide a diplomatic off-ramp has really shifted over the past few years. And I think it then becomes easier for states to kind of exploit these differences if they want to move forward with more illicit nuclear intentions. And the second point I would raise is that states are more likely to proliferate if they're concerned about alliance stability or the reliability of their defense partnerships. And I think this is often an underappreciated fact in discussing what motivates states to pursue nuclear weapons. But looking forward, if states want to hedge their bets because they don't see reliable defense partnerships, they don't have confidence that their alliances would hold in a time of crisis, then having a nuclear hedge becomes, I think, a more attractive option from a defense perspective. And it's hard to understate the damage that the Trump administration did in this space by calling into question US alliances, by calling into question US support for entities like NATO, and the possibility of a second Trump term, I think, which would further erode the credibility of US alliance and defense partnerships and further call into question the reliability and credibility of the United States as a partner. So again, I think these two broader shifts that we're seeing that have traditionally impacted how states think about proliferation are going to play into Saudi decision-making going forward.
Thank you very much for that. And I just, at this stage, wonder if any of the other panelists want to comment on what they've heard so far. Please, go ahead. Oh.
So I guess one quick point of historical analogy. It's very interesting that when the Shah of Iran in the mid-70s launched what we understand today as the Iranian nuclear program, a much smaller program had existed before, he made comments that were viewed as comparable to those of Mohammed bin Salman, saying that while the intention of our nuclear program is peaceful, if other smaller, conventionally weaker states in the region pursue nuclear weapons, then we'll keep this option open, and we may choose to exercise this option in the future, which resulted in considerable blowback, at least for his program, and then a long lobbying effort in order to try to address the damage that was fixed. And relatedly, one of the solutions that the United States sought to kind of utilize to address the Shah's own desire before the Iranian Islamic Revolution of 1979 to acquire nuclear fuel cycle capabilities, both nuclear enrichment and reprocessing, was to suggest a kind of multinational reprocessing or enrichment facility. In the case of the Shah, it would have been potentially overseen by France and the United States, perhaps also with the participation of Pakistan and certain other states of the region. In the case of the Saudis, I've heard similar proposals and maybe Chen or others could elaborate on maybe any proposals they've heard. But I've heard a similar proposal of having a multinational enrichment facility, which would perhaps involve the United States with some kind of mechanism to shut down the facility should Saudis be seen as exceeding the limits of the non-proliferation provisions within their agreements with the United States. That being said, regarding the kind of broader question of proliferation by allied states, what we know from the academic literature is that the U.S. And U.S. sanctions beginning in the 1970s were highly successful in restraining U.S. allies from pursuing these capabilities simply because the defense systems of these, and this is actually not simply because, this was one of the reasons, because the defense systems of these countries were so fundamentally tied up with that of the United States. And some prominent cases included Japan, the Republic of Korea, South Korea, as well as Taiwan, among others. Now, we could argue that the level of commitment with the U.S. to the Saudis doesn't currently reach this threshold, but I think when we look at the bigger picture, including U.S. arms supply and Western arms supply, important mechanisms exist for the United States to potentially restrain Saudi Arabia should it pursue that path. Now, will it exercise that option? Will it be willing to apply sanctions, as it threatened to do in the 1970s and afterwards against allies which were considering acquiring these fuel cycle capabilities? I'm not sure, but yeah.
So building on Kelsey's point about sort of the proliferation trends globally, but especially in the region, given the topic of our conference here, is that what we see today is really two parallel trends, and they have really contradictory implications on the non-proliferation implication of them in contradictory, but in the Middle East we live with duality all the time, so we'll have to live with these contradicting trends. And one of them is really hedging and proliferation. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to cross the threshold, but the hedging itself and successful hedging can be as problematic almost as a possession of nuclear weapons. And this happened both because of U.S. pivot away, or the wish or attempt to pivot away from the Middle East, the conclusion to the JCPOA, then the departure from the JCPOA. So practically countries in the region realize they don't have really, or they don't trust anymore their allies or partners, and then they start developing their own capabilities. So this is obviously the worrying trends that we see right now in the region. On the other end, and at the same time, what we see is really because the recognition that nobody is going to save us from ourselves, and we need to stop blaming our future or current situation on everyone else because it doesn't really help, is that countries in the region start to mature and really try to define their own future, get the agency in order to be able to do that. And really we see this ad hoc agreements and coalitions that we never saw beforehand. So if we speak about the Nogo Forum or the Abraham Accords, if we speak about the reconciliation with the Qatar getting back to the GCC, the demarcation, Lebanon, there is a huge list in the last, I would say, 5-7 years of things that we really did not think that possible beforehand. And this is a really positive trend. Now, I think we will see those two trends in parallel, and we need to figure out how to live with them. But I think this is a reflection of really, as Kelsey said, about the erosions of the global non-proliferation and how countries in the region trying to answer those and addressing their own national security concerns.
Thank you very much. Well, some challenging environment, but nonetheless, some very encouraging things to think about. And just on the point that Farzan, you made about the debate in the 70s, but now we see, for example, a very open debate in South Korea about, directly linked to questions about United States being there, and just a very broad and open debate about whether or not, and public opinion seemingly favoring a capability by South Korea. Okay, well, time marching on, we're going to shift gears a little bit and turn to Iran. And of course, we had, with the EU coordinator, Ambassador Clement, a reminder of the long saga of the negotiations, which ultimately culminated in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and then the further saga with, between the Biden administration and Iran on trying to revive some version of that deal, and he's given us some indication of the complications that would result there. And we've also had a little bit of discussion today, or reference to intermediate steps. So I'd like to turn to Henry Rome on our screen and talk about the implications of some of those steps. There have been recent media reports, and we've discussed here, that Iran has slowed down its buildup of enriched uranium. Ambassador Clement would like that, because he liked that that's what's happening. It's a slowing down of the buildup as opposed to a stopping of enriched uranium needed for the development of a nuclear bomb. And it's described by some experts, it wouldn't include Ambassador Clement, as a de-escalatory step, which was a consequence of an understanding reached in Oman between the U.S. and Iran, where the two sides indirectly agreed on how to free prisoners and de-escalate on the nuclear front. So my question to you, Henry, and then I'll go to Kelsey and then to the others. Could you please provide some insights on this informal arrangement? And do you see this as a step toward reaching a new form of nuclear agreement with Iran? Over to you, Henry.
Well, thanks very much. Thanks to the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy for convening this. And as Kelsey said, wish I could have been there in person, but happy for the opportunity to join virtually. I think the general point you laid out is the right one, that there are some de-escalatory steps that the U.S. and Iran have taken over the past several months, with the aim of at least lowering the temperature, not towards getting back to JCPOA. I think that's been quite clear that at least between now and the U.S. presidential election, a revival of the nuclear deal is not on the table, certainly not in Washington at this stage. And I think in practice, what the U.S. and Iran have been trying to do is what Eric Brewer and I wrote in a piece a few months ago called Plan C. And Plan A was revive the nuclear agreement. Plan B was an effort to increase pressure that some observers advocated for, including in Israel and many in the U.S., which the administration did not want to do given the potential ramifications of that. And so we settled on Plan C, which is essentially de-escalate tensions, buy time, with the hope that a deal could be more viable in the future. We've seen that manifestation in a lot of different ways. So regionally, there have been no attacks on U.S. forces by Iran-backed proxies for several months now. The exchange of prisoners, which went forth last week. The U.S. has not enforced a series of sanctions on Iranian oil exports, allowing them to reach a 4-year high. And the U.S. has not, and the E3 have not pursued a resolution at the Board of Governors against Iran, despite ample justification for doing so, and as well as there's not been any pursuit of snapback. And on the nuclear side, as was mentioned, you have a deceleration in the rate of accumulation of the 60%, some moves on transparency, but also some moves in the opposite direction on transparency. So it's a mixed bag from that point of view. But the overall trend, I think, is towards trying to de-escalate tensions. You asked whether this is a kind of a step towards a new approach of an agreement towards Iran, and I think the short answer is no. And I think ultimately you could argue that this policy is counterproductive to the ultimate goal of trying to do a nuclear agreement that results in a degradation of Iranian capabilities, not just freezing them in place. And of course, what's happened so far has not been to freeze the Iranian capabilities in place. And my worry is that this approach arguably makes reaching an agreement, let's say in 2025, all the more difficult because for a few reasons. One is the Iranian nuclear program continues to advance, and its advances are in some important ways occurring outside the vision of the IAEA. And it is solidifying its advances, I think, in important ways that might make it difficult for Iranian leaders to wind back the clock. And I think this time period, I think, is probably demonstrating that living without a nuclear agreement is actually not that bad of a proposition for some Iranian officials. And that's, I think, the opposite message that Western powers ought to be sending at this point, if the goal is to try to bring Iran back to not JCPOA as such, but some type of comprehensive nuclear agreement that we had before that was working, and I think could still work again. But that's just not where we are politically in Washington or Tehran. The issues that doomed the nuclear talks back in August/September of last year were regarding Iran's positions in those talks, but other issues have come up since then that make the issue all the more difficult. So happy to discuss in a little more detail, but that's the broad picture as I see it today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I'll turn just immediately now to Kelsey.
Sure. So, as Henry said, we have seen some positive de-escalatory steps on the nuclear front. I think reducing the rate at which Iran is enriching uranium to 60% is an interesting political signal that Tehran might be sending about its willingness to de-escalate. Iran puts a lot of importance on this stockpile because it is a key source of leverage. And we've also seen Iran really slow its rate of installation of advanced centrifuges, which advance uranium more quickly. And this is important because it does have implications for how quickly Iran could develop a small arsenal of nuclear weapons, and because of the knowledge Iran gains from operating those devices. And that, of course, cannot be reversed. So that's positive. But no real progress on the monitoring, and that's certainly concerning. So if the reports are true that the US and Iran may be engaging now in direct talks to further de-escalate tensions, and that those may be on the horizon, I really think the US focus has to be on incentivizing further monitoring by the International Atomic Energy Agency. In the short term, that has significant benefits because it deters any diversion of materials to an illicit program. And by materials, I don't mean nuclear materials. I think these are still, I think, well safeguarded. But the IAEA doesn't have access to the facilities where Iran produces centrifuges. So ensuring that all of the centrifuges remain in the declared program, that can be critical for de-escalating tensions further and providing more stability. And then in the long term, this type of access is really necessary to help preserve the space for future diplomacy. The IAEA can begin work trying to reestablish, inventories of certain materials. That will be critical for being able to verify limits under a future deal. And verifying those limits helps make an agreement more sustainable, in part because under US law, any administration that reaches a nuclear deal with Iran will have to submit a report to Congress about the IAEA's ability to verify it. So if the IAEA can access some of these facilities that it hasn't been able to inspect or monitor since February of 2021, then it can start to reconstruct some of that history. And that, I think, increases the likelihood of being able to have a verifiable deal that we can have some confidence in the future. So I think, more monitoring is a must. And then just quickly on whether or not these steps lead us to a longer term deal. I think Henry raises some great points about why it might indeed do the opposite. And I certainly agree that is a risk. But in the interest of maybe providing some alternative ideas, I think that it is possible to try to incentivize these steps and these processes towards a deal. I think the de-escalatory steps were necessary because the current trajectory wasn't sustainable if both sides, wanted to avoid a crisis. But once the nuclear crisis is more stable, once we have kind of additional monitoring, the growth of the program has slowed. If, say, the region were to throw its weight behind a process to, restrict or limit Iran's nuclear program, or support those negotiations with the United States, or even support a regional discussion about nuclear programs writ large. I think that could be, an important kind of factor in altering the calculus. And I think some of that, stems back to what Chen said about a recognition within the region about needing to change some of these trend lines and needing to think about, regional responsibility, in this space. So I am concerned that that Henry is right, and that this could be leading us, further away from the deal. But I think, now is the time to think critically about whether there are further steps that could be incentivized by the US, by the Europeans, by the region, to build time and space for more creative options that could actually lead us to a more sustainable nuclear deal in the longer term.
Thank you.
Sure. I can throw in a few more comments. So excellent comments by both Henry and Kelsey, laying out kind of Plan C, or this informal interim agreement, and its implications for kind of the future of the Iran nuclear issue. I just want to make some additional points. The first question is about if we're going to continue to do these kind of informal deals between now and the election, which was one of the comments that was there, or slightly afterwards. For example, it's a confidence building measure. What would the U.S. prospectively offer in exchange for kind of concessions from Iran? And like Henry says, what we know, at least publicly, the concession made by Iran has been relatively limited, which is slowing down the accumulation of 60% enriched uranium. One limiting factor could be the quantity of so-called trapped funds around the world in various jurisdictions. Earlier estimates of the quantity of these trapped funds, this is money that Iran accumulated in dollars and other currencies in kind of accounts around the world, but it couldn't transfer due to U.S. sanctions. Some estimates, earlier estimates, put these quantities of these funds between 80 upwards, sometimes of 100 billion. My understanding is the quantities of these trap funds could be significantly less. So if that's the case, and maybe Henry has some better numbers than I do on this, what would the U.S. offer in exchange? One might be tempted to say, well, the U.S. will further slacken sanctions, at least in the area of oil sanctions, which is the kind of major earner for Iran. It's a major part of its exports, major part of its budget. It's also the major part of the foreign exchange, which allows it to import key goods. I'm not sure the U.S. how much more the U.S. can slacken kind of its enforcements of sanctions around oil. The second issue is possible flashpoints, which could actually take us towards a more of an escalatory dynamic. One is confrontation over ship seizures in the Persian Gulf. My understanding is the U.S. recently offloaded Iranian oil, which was captured on a vessel, has offloaded that oil that will be sold, and that money will be put into fund for victims of terrorism, which Iran is alleged to have committed. In that instance, Iran might be tempted to escalate and continue to attempt to seize ships in the Persian Gulf or elsewhere. Second thing that could, second event or thing that could create escalatory dynamics would be, for example, a slow in Chinese industrial production, which decreases its need for oil and puts downward pressure on global oil prices. That could deliver a huge blow to the Iranian economy, depending on the size of the slowdown and decrease in oil prices, and might give it impetus then to escalate on some front in order to gain the resources that it needs to continue to operate its economy. And if I can make one more quick point, which is kind of the long-term structural dilemma the Islamic Republic faces. It's fundamentally one of trust. It doesn't trust the United States to adhere to any agreement that it signs up to. One option that was discussed, which is about creating some kind of mechanism, like putting into storage or an international facility Iran's nuclear infrastructure to be able to kind of break glass in case of a future U.S. withdrawal. I'm not sure such options or such mechanisms would be acceptable to the United States, and any administration making such a deal would be kind of under enormous pressure. And as a kind of extension of that, any Iranian government which makes a deal and then that deal is broken, especially a conservative government which is going to be contesting power and a possible leadership succession in the next couple of years, will also deal kind of a blow to its credibility in the domestic political sphere. So there's lots of complex security and domestic political situations in Iran which are caught up with this issue, which, at least in my view, restrains Iran's ability to enter a similar agreement to the JCPOA even after the election of a democratic administration.
I'm conscious we need to move to the audience questions, but I'm going to give Chen a chance to make a comment. But it just, in terms of trust, and it comes up, and I thought I was reminded of this when you mentioned the written guarantee from Congress that Saudi Arabia wanted. I mean, what form can that be, and how can one Congress bind the next? But really, I'm thinking of it here in the context of Iran, because of course one of their major concerns has been sanctions relief not carrying through, and no U.S. administration being able to sort of give that kind of guarantee. But anyway, I throw that out, but you may want to make another comment, and then I think we'll go to audience.
I can make comment about the sort of why it's important to try to find a solution to the Iranian issue, and not necessarily only, and that's obvious from the point of view of preventing Iran from crossing the threshold, but also from non-proliferation regime weaknesses. Because one of the issues that the current non-proliferation regime does not know to do is how to deal with latencies and hedging. This is not what it was designed for. It was designed for countries that decide not to have nuclear weapon or decide to have nuclear weapon and practically tested before 1968. It's not, doesn't know how to deal with latencies, hedging, and successfully exploiting them for deterrence, compellence, regime preservation, whatever the Iranian regime might think that they're achieving. And the problem is that if it's successful, as you mentioned, South Korea already took some leaf of that notebook. Practically what the Saudis are doing right now with playing their hands with the US on one hand, Israel and China and Russia on the other hand, is exactly that as well, without even having a nuclear program. So the question is how we prevent that, and that, I would say, is very important, because the regime as we know it right now does not have the tools to deal with latencies, and we don't want other countries think that it is a successful state of being that will try to follow such a situation or status.
Thank you very much for that. Okay, I think now I've been told that we can extend for 10 minutes. Well, it's I guess be 8 minutes now. We can extend until 5:55, and so I'd like to turn now to audience questions. And if you would, I guess we'll take a couple to start with, and if you could introduce yourselves go to a microphone and. I can barely see you with the glaring light, but yes, over there.
Yeah, George Jacoby, a retired Canadian diplomat who worked in the Middle East and also a lot on non-proliferation, including at the 1990 NPT review conference with Ms. Mason, our ambassador for disarmament at the time. I'd just like to ask whether there's any chance of utilizing what we've talked about today, namely an extension of the Abraham Accords with Saudi, under American auspices, with Saudi leverage, and the Saudi-Iranian compromise with China backing that to try and sort of jumpstart the nuclear situation, wherein Israel would get normalization with Saudi Arabia, give up its nuclear weapons, which would then allow the idea of a Middle East nuclear-free zone to take place. You would have Iran, a member of the NPT under full-scope safeguards, Saudi, a member of the NPT under full-scope safeguards, Israel joining the NPT under full-scope safeguards, and then all of the region being the beneficiaries of civil nuclear cooperation with the rest of the world within the context of a nuclear-free zone.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. And have we got another question here that we can take? Everyone's questioned out. Okay. Well, I'll turn to any panelists. The ones on the screen, please put your hand up. Give me an indication if you want to answer. I don't see any hands up there. So.
Yeah, I'll take a crack at it. So I think the Saudi-Iran rapprochement was, in part at least, an attempt by Saudi to deal with some of its issues with Iran, which it couldn't do through the United States, as it had sought to do under the Trump administration. And since it, at least in the P5+1 nuclear talks, it didn't have a seat at the table. But these regional dynamics don't necessarily extend to the Iranian nuclear issue. It kind of operates at a level slightly above the region and kind of dealing with fundamental problems in the U.S.-Iran relationship. At least from the Iranian perspective, these include various attempts over history of regime change in Iran, and attempts to kind of force the United States to accept a certain Iranian status in the region, and also as a mechanism to try to kind of lift at least some of the most powerful U.S. sanctions against it. So I think the Iran-Saudi rapprochement and kind of regional initiatives can certainly contribute to that dynamic, but I don't see kind of Abraham's Accord and Saudi-Iran rapprochement kind of coming together as being able to make significant progress towards addressing the Iranian nuclear issue.
And about the question about expanding. So with the question in regard to the expanding the Abraham Accords to also non-proliferation issues, because so far it has not been. So one of the baskets of practically the negaform is regional security. So far it has not been expanding to non-proliferation issues, although they have been discussing some confidence-building measures and de-escalatory measures. Whether Saudi Arabia will join, it's an open question, but if they will join a process, and this again, we're not sure if they will join the Abraham Accord as it is right now, but if they will join some process, I think some of Israeli concerns regard to peace agreements, and normalization is not peace agreement, but let's assume there will be a peace agreements as well, and how to address their concerns regard to regional security. This is not including only nuclear, it's including a long list, and I'm sure you heard their statements, and that has not changed for the last 45 years. So it's the same concerns regard to missiles, to delivery systems, besides of the issue of normalizations of relationship, peace agreement, and reconciliation. So the question, will any process that exists right now or can be expanded and will address the Israeli concern, is an open question. I do not know, but I wish. The other part that you mentioned is that I do not think that what you meant is actually that the zone will be only under a comprehensive safeguard agreement, since we proved already that comprehensive safeguard agreements do not work well in the Middle East. And what right now the aspiration is at least for additional protocol, and maybe that will be sufficient, but I do not believe that safeguard comprehensive agreement will be. So addressing how we prevent current proliferation, or how we reverse current proliferation, as well as how we prevent new one, will have to be much more than the current tools that we have under comprehensive safeguard agreement.
One very quick point. Since I think starting from the previous panel, there's been quite a, with certain exceptions of some of the points that Kelsey made, quite a large degree of skepticism about the prospects for a nuclear deal with Iran before an election and even to some extent after an election. I will note that there's been unconfirmed reporting from this morning that the Iranian Supreme Leader has given a green light for Iranian officials to meet directly with U.S. officials, which was not the case prior, including in a specific format in Oman. If true, it could point to a tactical or strategic shift on the part of Iran in terms of its approach to a nuclear deal and its desire to kind of seriously pursue such a deal. I'm not sure the reports, as far as I know, remain unconfirmed, but just a small update.
Thank you very much. Unless I've got a burning follow-up from the screen, we're reaching our extended time, so I think I'd like to thank our panelists on the screen and next to me very, very much. Making accessible a very challenging topic, and I'd like to thank all of the audience for its grit and determination to stay, and we've got one more panel, which I know will be also worth your endurance before we start the reception. And the new panel, I am told, yes, it'll start, I think I'm supposed to tell you what the name of it is to make sure that the path forward to balance interests and uphold values in the new Middle East, and it'll be starting in 5 minutes. Thank you all very much.